It was the worst man-made ecological disaster in U.S. history when greed, misuse of once fertile grasslands, and a decade of drought devastated the high plains and almost ruined the breadbasket of America. The panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma were at the epicenter of the Dust Bowl, and many who stayed have inconceivable tales of survival and loss. Wet sheets over windows, Black Sunday, and the funerals of mostly the young and old, their lungs no match for the insidious dust. But the stories of those survivors, the ones who held on during the 30s, had never been shared on a national scale until our guest this week, Timothy Egan, published The Worst Hard Time in 2006, nearly 70 years after the land and its people began to recover. Egan won a National Book Award for his work, which tells a story of endurance and heroism against the backdrop of the Great Depression. Please help me welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist and best-selling author Timothy Egan. We are so excited to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for bringing me back.
Well, now, who knew that so many people would be interested in our story?
That's the question that sort of dogged me at night. I would just lie awake and I would just go, who's going to want to read about this? Who's going to want to respond to the story? And then lo and behold, a lot of people wanted to know this story. You know, it's your story in the sense that this is your region's, this is the equivalent of your Civil War in that sense, but it's also an American story too, and I want this to be part of the larger American tableau. I want most Americans to have this be part of their history.
You know, you're surrounded today by people who, we have one survivor in the audience, and then many of us have parents or grandparents who are part of that two-thirds, the two-thirds that stayed.
Right.
So we think it's interesting that somebody from the Pacific Northwest is the one telling the story. How did you come upon it?
You think it's interesting. I think it's interesting because I come from a land of rain and green and rivers and mountains, and I almost get sort of reverse claustrophobic when I'm on the high plains because I look around for mountains. I'm sort of the accidental Dust Bowl historian because I was poking around the high plains doing a series for the New York Times on the collapse of small town America. And it's a really interesting story because, you know, we used to be a nation of farmers. We had all these little towns built by the railroads for folks that worked in agriculture. And 3 out of 10 Americans worked in agriculture. Well, now it's 1 out of 100. So the towns are dying. And I was doing this, you know, pretty sad story of little towns blown away. And after a while, I kept hearing the same of another story, which was the 1930s. And I thought I knew what happened in the 30s. Everyone moved to California. And it turned out it was one of those monumental first takes of history that was only partially right.
Mm-hmm. Most people know the Grapes of Wrath. A lot of people, on a national scale, we had heard it but had never heard what happened.
And I'll tell you something about the Grapes of Wrath. Most of those people who moved to California or my state in Washington weren't from the Panhandle. They weren't from, you know, Oklahoma. They weren't from Kansas. They were from parts of Arkansas and Missouri, and they didn't own property. They were tenant farmers. So it was much easier for them to pick up and go because they didn't have anything. But people who stayed behind did own something, and they wanted to hold on to that.
So that answers the question, maybe partially answers the question, why did they stay?
That's a complex thing, but yeah, that's partially why, exactly.
Yeah. I hear that you weren't quite sure there was a book in it to begin with.
I don't know where you heard that, but it's correct.
Dayton Duncan told me.
Right. That's very good. I've never been asked that before, and thank you. I didn't think there was a book here. I didn't take any money from an advance or anything. I came down and spent a lot of time doing my initial historical foraging. You know, I was the person just going and clawing and looking for detail and story. And I remember my epiphany moment was being in Springfield, Colorado, which is the little corner southeast section of High Plains, kind of another little town that's sort of blown away. I think the main restaurant there, I hope I'm not offending them, is a fast food place where that hot dog's going around at all times. And I had assembled a group of people, and I sat, this is what I ended up doing a lot later, and I sat in the room with them, and I heard these marvelous stories. And I went back to my hotel room, and I was so moved by what I'd heard. And I knew then there was a book here, and I said to myself, why hasn't this story been told? And more importantly, why not tell the story before these people disappear? Because, I mean, what if we were telling a first take of the Civil War and we were all relying on documents or letters? It's so different and so important to be able to look into someone's eyes and to judge their feelings and their thoughts by facial reaction, and to hear their voice and to see them cry or to see them laugh, you know. And I got to the point where I was sort of a time traveler. I'd be looking in someone's eye and I'd be interviewing them. They were 91, 92, and I wouldn't see an old person. I would see a 17-year-old girl just out of high school. And I could sort of see the grass, and I could see her face, and I could see all the world ahead of her, and then all the world coming down on her too.
You know, when one interviews World War II survivors, the experience I've had is that sometimes they're dredging up memories for you that they really haven't talked about in a long time. Sometimes their families have never heard it. Did that happen during this?
That's a great point, Ellen, because people from World War II are similar to Dust Bowl survivors, and that my experience at least is that they stopped talking about their story for a while for two reasons. One is people didn't believe them. You know, it's so far removed from our comfortable lives. I was telling someone earlier that, you know, to me, what upsets me is when I'm out of cell phone range, or, you know, I only get 2 bars. What a tragedy. Well, a tragedy is when the sky turns black at midnight. A tragedy is when everything you've put in the ground is dead. A tragedy is when you're literally eating roadkill. A tragedy is when your little girl, your little boy has to go to bed hungry. A tragedy is when the wind will never stop carrying the earth that you thought was going to save you and dropping it down on you as you sleep. So they stopped telling those stories because they seemed unfathomable to a modern audience. And they just thought no. And the other thing is, this is what's really sad. They didn't think people wanted to hear. I'll tell you very quickly, one of the women I focused on, she was a feature in my story, and she finally got her story told. Her mother was a Broadway dancer. She'd come here for the air because the doctor said, you got to get out of New York. The air is terrible. Go to the plains. And so this Broadway dancer comes here and marries a cowboy, has this little girl. Of course, the little girl ends up with dust pneumonia. I told her story, and she was marvelous. And after the book came out, she called me up and she said, you know, little kids are knocking on my door. They want to do their 6th grade paper on me. The Rotary wants me to speak at lunch. And she said, Tim, you've made me like a rock star. You know? So I was really happy that after not telling her story for 50, 60 years, everyone wanted to hear her story.
You interviewed, I've heard you say, you interviewed 100 people traveling through here. I'm picturing you going from town to town. How did you find them? What did you do? How did you get their stories?
You know, it's actually relatively easy. It goes to what I just said, that people do want to tell their stories. The problem is, you know, how do you get them to tell your stories, and how do you get to the truth of a story? Because memory plays tricks with us. Over the years, just by selection, we block out the bad memories and we remember the good memories. And remember, our Dust Bowl survivors right now were teenagers. Some of them were in their 20s, but most of them were teenagers or little kids. So it's filtered through the lens of a kid or a teenager. That's the other thing to remember. And thank you for giving me that image, sort of the traveling historian going from town to town, eating really good food. And it was very easy. I would just go to a town, and no matter the size of the town, whether it's 500 people or 5,000 people, there is some keeper of the story. Now, maybe it's not a formal keeper, the county records person or the county historical museum. I would just say, who knows the story? And they'd say, well, so-and-so down the street. So I'd find someone who was the keeper of the record, of the history. And I would say, can you get me a group of people who were around in the dirty 30s? And so we would just sit and talk. And I would mostly just listen to these stories.
You also have journals from that era and, of course, government documents. How did you know when you found the gold?
That's very well put. It is gold. If you're a writer and a storyteller, you live for authenticity. You live for detail. You live for texture. And we are not a letter-writing nation anymore. We text, we tweet. My kids barely do that. We don't really keep family diaries anymore. Well, these folks did. They kept exhaustive family diaries and stories. And so I would read these. They're basically a history of how your family got here and and they wanted someone to know you lived through this damn hard time, that you made it. You're not going to live through it, but someone's going to come upon your little treasure and open this thing and read your words. That happened to me. I mentioned earlier today about a diary of a man who was ruined, had his male pride, his sense of self was broken by a dust storm. And he wrote this daily account. Typical guy, he would talk about the baseball score first. He was listening to he lived in Nebraska, but he was able to get Yankee games, and he hated the Yankees. It's good to hear there's some things are consistent over time, because we all still hate the Yankees, outside of New York, except. But it just was this slow drip torture of how those hard times hurt him. So yes, I look for diaries and letters for texture and detail. What the day was like. What did it smell like? What did you eat? What was, there were no fat people. I mean, it's amazing. Everyone was pretty lean. How did you, how could you still fall in love? Well, because love has never changed. And I've read these wonderful letters from a 17-year-old girl who married her high school sweetheart, and these beautiful love letters, while the whole world's caving in. So you look for that in order to, I really wanted to do not a top-down history. Most history is told from the point of view of the president or the great man or the great woman. I wanted to do a history told from the margins.